November 1932. Deep in the Appalachian mountains of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to the valleys like wet wool and coal dust settles on everything it touches, the small mining town of Blackheath Ridge held a secret that would haunt it forever. On a Sunday morning when the church bells should have been calling the faithful to worship, they instead told a warning that no one understood until it was far too late. The town sat in a narrow valley, squeezed between two steep ridges covered in bare November trees. 300 souls called this place home, most of them miners who worked the Montgomery Coal Company shaft that burrowed deep into the mountain's belly. Their faces were perpetually smudged with coal dust, their lungs blackened by years of breathing underground air. The depression had hit hard here, harder than most places, but the mine kept running and people kept working because there was nothing else. At the center of town stood the First Baptist Church of Blackheath Ridge, a white clapboard building with a tall steeple that could be seen from every corner of the valley. Reverend Thomas Holloway had preached there for 17 years, his voice booming from the pulpit every Sunday morning and Wednesday evening without fail. He was a severe man with iron-gray hair and eyes that seemed to look straight through to your sins. People respected him more than they loved him, but respect was enough in a place like this. On that particular Sunday, the morning began like any other. Families dressed in their best clothes, which meant clean overalls for the men and faded cotton dresses for the women. Children had their faces scrubbed and their hair combed flat with water. By 9:30, they began walking toward the church, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The sky hung low and gray, threatening rain or perhaps early snow. Inside the church, the choir assembled in their usual places. There were 12 of them, ranging from young Martha Yates, just 16 with a voice like a songbird, to old Samuel Pritchard, who had been singing bass in that choir for 40 years. They wore simple robes that Martha's mother had sewn from white cotton fabric, and they took their positions on the wooden risers behind the pulpit. The piano sat to the left, where Eleanor Mackenzie would play the hymns she had practiced all week. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that beneath the church, the ground had been slowly giving way for months. The Montgomery Coal Company had dug too deep, pushed too far into the mountain, creating a vast network of tunnels that honeycombed the earth below Blackheath Ridge. In their hunger for profit, they had miscalculated, ignored the warnings of experienced miners who said the seams were running too close to the surface near the town. The company foreman had dismissed these concerns, ordered the men to keep digging, keep pulling coal from the ground. Through October and into November, small cracks had appeared in the church foundation. Reverend Holloway had noticed them, but assumed they were merely the settling of an old building, nothing to worry about. A few women mentioned that their houses had developed cracks too, that doors no longer hung quite straight in their frames. But this was chalked up to the changing weather, the freezing and thawing of the ground. No one connected these signs to what was happening deep below. By 10 o'clock that Sunday morning, nearly the entire town had gathered inside the church. The pews were packed with families sitting shoulder to shoulder, sharing hymnals and prayer books. Children fidgeted in their seats while their mothers gave them stern looks to keep still. The coal stove in the back corner worked hard to warm the space, its pipe running up through the ceiling. The smell of burning wood mixed with the scent of mothballs from Sunday clothes that spent most of the week in closets. Reverend Holloway stood at the pulpit, his Bible open before him. He cleared his throat, ready to begin the service, when the choir rose to sing the opening hymn. Their voices lifted together, filling the church with sound that echoed off the wooden walls and high ceiling. It was a moment of beauty in a hard life, a moment when everything seemed right with the world. But beneath their feet, invisible and unstoppable, the earth had already begun to move. The hymn they sang was an old one, passed down through generations of mountain churches. The words spoke of solid ground and steadfast faith, of foundations that could not be shaken. The irony would not be lost on those who survived to remember it. As the choir's voices rose and fell in practiced harmony, a low rumble began somewhere deep beneath the church, so subtle at first that most people dismissed it as distant thunder from the grey sky outside. But Thomas Crane, who had worked in the mines for 30 years and knew the language of the earth, felt something wrong in that sound. He sat in the third pew with his wife and 4 children, and when that rumble reached his ears, his body went rigid. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before in 1919, when a section of the mine had collapsed and killed 6 men. It was the sound of the earth losing its grip on itself, of support giving way, of gravity claiming what had been held up too long. Thomas stood abruptly, startling his wife beside him. Several people turned to look at him with annoyed expressions, disturbed by his sudden movement during the hymn. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, to tell everyone to run. But at that exact moment the choir reached a crescendo, their voices swelling to fill every corner of the church, and his words were lost in the music. He grabbed his wife's arm and pulled her to her feet, reaching for his children, trying to move them toward the aisle. The rumble grew louder, no longer something that could be dismissed or ignored. Other miners began to recognize it too, began to feel that terrible wrongness in their bones. But the choir kept singing, committed to their performance. Their faces lifted toward the ceiling as they praised in perfect harmony. The piano accompaniment drove forward, Eleanor's fingers flying across the keys, her foot pumping the pedals. The congregation sat frozen, caught between the beauty of the music and the growing terror of that sound from below. Then the floor dropped. Not all at once, not catastrophically, but in a slow, sickening lurch that sent everyone stumbling. The pews shifted, their legs scraping across floorboards that were no longer level. Women screamed, children cried out, men cursed and grabbed for anything solid to hold on to. But still, the choir sang, perhaps not realizing what was happening, perhaps too committed to their hymn to break away from it, their voices now taking on a desperate, almost frantic quality. The walls began to crack with sounds like rifle shots. Long splits appeared in the white plaster, running from floor to ceiling in jagged lines. The windows, old glass set in wooden frames, shattered one by one, sending shards raining down on the people below. Cold November air rushed in through the broken openings, carrying with it the smell of disturbed earth and something else, something older and darker that had been buried for ages. Thomas Crane fought his way toward the door, pushing his family ahead of him, shouting for others to follow. Some listened and began to move, creating a surge toward the exits, but others remained in their pews, paralyzed by fear or disbelief, or the strange compulsion to hear the choir finish their hymn. Reverend Holloway stood at his pulpit, gripping its edges with white knuckles, his mouth open but no words coming out. He had preached about the end times, about earthquakes and tribulations, but facing it now he found himself utterly unprepared. The church lurched again, dropping another foot into the earth. The stove in the back corner toppled over, its pipe tearing free from the ceiling, and within seconds flames began to lick at the wooden walls. Smoke filled the air, mixing with the dust that poured from the cracking plaster. People were screaming now, a full panic taking hold, bodies pressing against each other in a desperate push toward the doors. But the doors, their frames twisted by the settling structure, no longer opened easily. Through it all impossibly, the choir continued to sing. Their voices cracked and wavered, tears streaming down some of their faces, but they held their positions on the risers and kept producing those notes. Martha Yates sang with her eyes closed, her young face serene despite the chaos, as if she had accepted something the others had not. Samuel Pritchard's bass voice boomed out over the screaming, over the cracking walls, over the roar of flames. Eleanor kept playing the piano, even as the keys began to stick and the strings went out of tune from the twisting of the frame. Outside, those who had escaped stood in the muddy street and watched in horror as the church continued its impossible descent into the earth. The steeple tilted at a severe angle, its white paint stark against the grey November sky. The building seemed to be sinking into a hole that had not existed moments before, as if the ground had simply opened its mouth and begun to swallow the structure whole. And from inside, clearly audible despite the chaos, came the sound of the choir still singing. Thomas Crane had managed to get his entire family out, along with perhaps 40 others who had been quick enough or lucky enough to reach the doors before they became impassable. They stood now in a loose group, their Sunday clothes already filthy with mud and dust, staring at the impossible scene before them. Some wept openly, others stood in shock, unable to process what their eyes were showing them. A few men started forward, thinking to attempt a rescue, but the ground around the church had become unstable, cracking and heaving in ways that made any approach suicidal. The mine whistle began to blow from up the valley, its shrill scream cutting through the morning air. Someone had run to alert the company that something terrible was happening in town. Within minutes, miners who had been working the morning shift came running, still in their work clothes, their helmets with carbide lamps still strapped to their heads. They knew immediately what had happened. The tunnels had collapsed, or more accurately, the surface had collapsed into the tunnels. The church had been built directly over what was now a massive sinkhole, but knowing what had happened did nothing to stop it. The church continued to sink, now at a faster rate, as if gravity had grown impatient. The walls compressed inward, boards snapping with sounds like breaking bones. The remaining windows exploded outward from the pressure. Smoke poured from every opening, black and thick, carrying with it the smell of burning wood and fabric and something else, something chemical from the paint and varnish that had been applied over decades of upkeep. And still the choir sang. Their voices had taken on an otherworldly quality now, no longer quite human in their persistence. Some said later that it sounded like the singing was coming from somewhere beyond the church, from the earth itself, though others insisted this was just the acoustic effect of the building sinking into a hole. The hymn they had started with should have been finished long ago, but they seemed to have moved into another song and then another, their repertoire flowing together into one continuous stream of sound that refused to stop, even as their world collapsed around them. Inside the church, those who remained faced a choice they could not have imagined making when they woke that morning. The door was blocked now, buried under fallen timbers and debris. The windows were too high and too small to offer escape. Fire spread across the walls and ceiling, consuming the dry wood with terrible efficiency. Smoke filled the space, making breathing difficult, making seeing impossible. People huddled together in family groups, holding each other, praying in voices hoarse from screaming and coughing. Reverend Holloway finally found his voice. He began to pray, loud and strong, his words cutting through the chaos. He prayed for deliverance, for mercy, for the souls of his congregation. Some joined him, their voices ragged but determined. But the choir, standing on their risers at the front of the church, even as the floor tilted at an ever steeper angle, did not pray. They sang. They sang as if singing was the only thing left to do, as if their voices might somehow hold back the earth, or extinguish the flames or reverse the terrible physics that were pulling them down. The church dropped again, a sickening plunge that left everyone's stomach in their throat. They were now 20 feet below street level, sinking into a crater that widened as they fell. The timbers that supported the floor above the basement gave way entirely, and suddenly there was no floor, only a jumble of broken wood and furniture falling into darkness below. People clung to pews, to walls, to each other, anything to avoid sliding into that black void that had opened beneath them. Martha Yates lost her grip on the riser and fell, her white choir robe billowing around her as she dropped into the darkness below the church. Her voice cut off mid-note, replaced by a scream that seemed to go on forever before ending abruptly. Samuel Pritchard reached for her, his old hands grasping at air, and then he too lost his balance and fell. One by one, the choir members tumbled into the void, their voices silencing as they disappeared. Yet somehow impossibly the singing continued, as if the air itself had memorized the hymns and refused to let them die. The miners organized quickly, their training in disaster response taking over where shock had paralyzed them. They formed a chain, passing ropes and timbers from hand to hand, trying to construct some kind of scaffold that might allow them to reach the people still trapped in the sinking church. But the ground was too unstable. Every time someone tried to get close to the edge of the crater, the earth would crumble beneath their feet, sending them scrambling backward to safety. They were being forced to watch, helpless, as their neighbors and families were swallowed by the mountain. One miner, a young man named David Hutchins, whose wife and infant son were inside the church, broke free from the others and ran toward the crater's edge. He had rope tied around his waist, other men holding the other end, and he managed to get within 10 feet of the tilting structure before the ground gave way beneath him. He dropped suddenly, his scream cut short as the rope caught and held him dangling over the void. The men pulled him back, his hands bleeding, his face covered in mud, and when they got him to safety he collapsed and wept like a child. The church was now nearly 40 feet below street level, and still it sank. The crater around it had widened to perhaps 60 feet across, its edges ragged and unstable. Houses nearby began to show signs of stress, their foundations cracking, their walls leaning inward toward the hole. Families evacuated in panic, grabbing what they could carry and running up the hillside to higher ground. The entire center of town was being pulled down into the earth, as if something below was hungry, and the church was merely the first course. Through it all, that singing continued. It was quieter now, muffled by earth and distance, but unmistakably there. People standing at the crater's edge could hear it drifting up from below, that strange, persistent melody that refused to acknowledge the reality of what was happening. Some said it was beautiful, in a terrible sort of way. Others said it was the most horrifying sound they had ever heard, worse than the screaming had been, because it suggested something beyond normal human behavior, some kind of madness or possession that had taken hold of the choir in their final moments. The fire inside the church had consumed most of the wooden structure now, leaving only the heaviest timbers still standing. Flames shot up from the crater like some hellish chimney, and the heat was intense enough that people 100 feet away had to shield their faces. The smoke rose in a black column straight up into the grey November sky, visible for miles in every direction. In neighboring towns, people saw that smoke and wondered what disaster had befallen Blackheath Ridge, but the roads were too rough and too few for help to arrive quickly. By noon, the church had sunk completely out of sight. The crater remained, a gaping wound in the earth roughly 80 feet across and perhaps 60 feet deep, its sides steep and unstable. The singing had finally stopped, though no one could say exactly when. Some claimed they heard it until the very end, until the last visible piece of the church disappeared below ground level. Others said it stopped earlier when the fire reached its peak. A few insisted, and would insist for the rest of their lives, that they could still hear it even now, faint and distant, coming from somewhere deep in the earth. The mine superintendent arrived with a crew of engineers, and they examined the crater with grim faces. The news was worse than anyone had feared. The tunnels beneath the town had not simply collapsed in one location. They were failing along a quarter-mile stretch, weakened by aggressive mining and poor planning. The entire town was at risk. Every building, every home, every structure might follow the church into the ground. Evacuation was not optional. It was immediate and mandatory. By nightfall, Blackheath Ridge was a ghost town. 300 people, minus the 73 who had died in the church, gathered their belongings and left the only home most of them had ever known. They moved to neighboring towns, slept in churches and school gymnasiums, dependent on charity and the thin hope that the mining company might provide some kind of compensation. Most knew better than to count on that. The company would declare bankruptcy, the owners would disappear, and the people of Blackheath Ridge would be left with nothing but memories and grief. Thomas Crane stood at the edge of town as the sun set, looking back at the crater that had swallowed the church. Other survivors stood with him, silent and shell-shocked, unable to quite believe the events of the day. Tomorrow they would begin the process of rebuilding their lives elsewhere, but tonight they simply stood and stared and tried to understand how their world had ended in a single morning. And in the growing darkness, some of them swore they could still hear it, faint, impossibly distant, but unmistakable. The choir, still singing somewhere in the depths below. The winter of 1932 turned brutal early, as if nature itself wanted to punish what remained of Blackheath Ridge. Snow fell heavy and thick, burying the crater and the abandoned buildings under a white shroud. The mine company posted guards around the perimeter to keep people from returning, though few had any desire to go back. The town had become a forbidden place, marked on maps with warnings about unstable ground and structural hazards. Insurance investigators came and went, taking photographs and measurements, filing reports that would gather dust in company archives. Thomas Crane found work in a mine 30 miles away, in a town called Harlan. The pay was worse and the conditions harder, but it was work, and his family needed to eat. He rented a small house with walls so thin you could hear conversations from 3 doors down. His children adapted as children do, making new friends at school, slowly forgetting the specifics of that terrible Sunday morning. But Thomas could not forget. Every night when he closed his eyes, he heard that singing, saw the church tilting as it sank, felt the floor dropping beneath his feet. He was not alone in his haunting. Across eastern Kentucky, the survivors of Blackheath Ridge carried their trauma like a physical weight. Some turned to drinking, drowning their memories in moonshine and cheap whiskey. Others found religion with renewed fervor, attending services multiple times a week, as if enough prayer might somehow balance the scales for those who had died. A few simply broke, their minds unable to process what they had witnessed, and they ended up in state hospitals, where doctors had no name for what afflicted them. The families of the dead demanded answers. Why had the mine company been allowed to dig so close to the town? Why had no inspections caught the danger? Why had there been no warning systems in place? They hired lawyers who filed lawsuits that would drag through courts for years before being quietly settled for amounts that insulted the memory of the deceased. The company paid out just enough to avoid criminal charges, but accepted no responsibility for what had happened. It was an act of God, they claimed, an unforeseeable geological event that no amount of planning could have prevented. But the miners knew better. They had warned the supervisors for months that the tunnels were too shallow, too close to the surface. They had pointed out cracks in the rock face, unusual water seepage, strange sounds in the deep shafts that suggested the mountain was under stress. Every warning had been dismissed, every concern overruled by the pressure to extract more coal, produce more profit, meet quotas set by executives who had never set foot in a mine. The deaths in Blackheath Ridge were not an accident. They were murder by negligence, though no court would ever call it that. Spring came, and with it came stories. A traveling salesman passing near the abandoned town claimed he heard singing coming from the crater, clear as day despite no one being anywhere nearby. A group of teenage boys, daring each other to explore the ruins, ran screaming back to their homes, swearing they had seen figures in white robes standing at the crater's edge. A Methodist preacher from 2 counties over reported a dream where he stood in the sinking church and watched the choir singing as the earth swallowed them, and the dream had felt more real than waking life. Most people dismissed these accounts as superstition, the kind of ghost stories that naturally arise from tragedy, but the stories persisted and multiplied. A logger working in the hills above the old town site heard hymns echoing through the trees on a still morning. A hunter tracking deer found himself near the crater and swore the ground beneath his feet vibrated with some deep resonance, like the sustained note of an enormous organ. Children in neighboring towns began having nightmares about sinking churches and singing that never stopped. David Hutchins, the young miner who had tried to rescue his wife and child, became obsessed with the crater. He would travel back to Blackheath Ridge on his days off, standing at the snow-covered edge, staring down into the hole that had taken everything from him. Other survivors begged him to stop, told him he was making his grief worse, but he could not stay away. He said he needed to be close to them, to the place where they had died. He said sometimes he could hear his wife's voice in the wind, and if he listened hard enough he might hear his son too. By summer, the crater had partially filled with water, creating a murky pond surrounded by collapsed buildings and overgrown streets. The Montgomery Coal Company declared bankruptcy and dissolved, its assets sold off to pay creditors, leaving the survivors with nothing. Blackheath Ridge was officially removed from state maps, designated as uninhabitable land. It became a place that had existed and then stopped existing, erased from official records as if 300 people had never built their lives there. But erasure from maps did not mean erasure from memory. The survivors gathered once a year on the anniversary of the disaster, meeting in the church of whatever town was hosting them. They would sing the same hymns that had been sung that morning, a deliberate act of remembrance and defiance. Thomas Crane always attended, though the singing made his chest tight and his hands shake. He felt he owed it to those who had died, to bear witness, to ensure their deaths meant something beyond just another industrial tragedy in a region full of them. The second anniversary brought revelation. A geology professor from the University of Kentucky, a man named Dr. Harold Pemberton, had been studying the collapse as part of his research on karst topography and mining impacts. He arrived at the memorial service with maps and documents, seeking to speak with survivors. What he told them changed their understanding of what had happened that November morning, though it brought no comfort. According to Dr. Pemberton's research, the church had not simply fallen into a mining tunnel. The collapse had triggered a much larger geological event, opening up a natural cave system that had existed beneath Blackheath Ridge for thousands of years. The mines had weakened the thin layer of rock that separated the surface from these caverns, and when the church fell through, it had dropped not 60 feet, but closer to 200, landing in an underground chamber that had never seen daylight. The crater, they could see, was just the entrance to something far deeper and more vast. This news hit the survivors like a physical blow. Their loved ones had not died quickly in fire and collapse. They had fallen into darkness, into some ancient hollow in the mountain's heart, and whatever had happened to them down there was beyond imagining. Some of the survivors refused to believe it, insisting Dr. Pemberton was mistaken or lying. Others accepted it with a kind of grim fatalism, as if this final terrible detail was simply the universe ensuring their suffering was complete. But Dr. Pemberton was not finished. He had found something else, something he hesitated to share but felt obligated to reveal. In the months following the collapse, his team had lowered recording equipment into the crater, trying to map the underground spaces using sound reflection. The recordings had captured something unexpected. At certain times, usually in the early morning hours, the equipment picked up what sounded like human voices, distant and distorted but unmistakably present. He played the recordings for the gathered survivors, his hands trembling slightly as he worked the playback device. The sound that filled the church was barely recognizable as singing, warped by distance and interference into something alien and disturbing. But underneath the distortion, the melody was clear. It was the same hymn the choir had been singing when the church fell. The survivors sat in stunned silence, some weeping, others stone-faced, as they listened to that impossible sound. Dr. Pemberton explained that there must be some acoustic phenomenon at work, some quirk of the cave system that captured and replayed sounds, though he admitted he could not fully explain the mechanism. Thomas Crane stood abruptly and walked out of the church. Others followed him, unable to bear another moment of that recording. They stood outside in the summer heat, the sun bright and normal, and completely at odds with the horror they had just experienced. David Hutchins remained inside, listening to the recording play again and again, his face blank, his eyes focused on something no one else could see. When the service finally ended and people began to leave, he was still sitting there, still listening. The story of Dr. Pemberton's recordings spread quickly through the mountain communities. Newspapers picked it up, sensationalizing it with headlines about ghost choirs and haunted mines. The story reached Nashville, then Louisville, then papers as far away as Chicago and New York. Blackheath Ridge became famous for its tragedy, a cautionary tale about corporate greed and a mystery that scientists could not fully explain. Curiosity seekers began showing up, trying to find the crater, hoping to hear the singing for themselves. The state eventually fenced off the entire area, posting no trespassing signs and threatening arrest for anyone caught entering. But fences have never stopped determined people, and the legend of the singing crater only grew stronger with official attempts to suppress it. People reported hearing the hymns from miles away, carrying on the wind through the mountain passes. Others claimed to see lights in the crater at night, moving in patterns that suggested human activity where no humans should be. Thomas Crane tried to move forward with his life. He worked his shifts in the mine, came home to his family, attended church on Sundays. But the question haunted him, kept him awake at night, gnawed at his peace. If Dr. Pemberton was right, if his loved ones had fallen into some deep cavern, then what had happened to them down there? Had they died on impact? Had they survived for a time in the darkness? And most disturbing of all, could those recordings really be just acoustic anomalies, or was something else happening in the depths beneath Blackheath Ridge? 5 years passed. The depression deepened, and the disaster at Blackheath Ridge became just another tragedy in a decade full of them. The survivors dispersed across Kentucky and beyond, seeking work, seeking distance from their memories. Some succeeded in building new lives. Others never recovered, carrying their grief like a stone in their chest until it finally stopped their hearts. The annual memorial services grew smaller as people moved away or died or simply decided they could not bear to remember anymore. David Hutchins never stopped visiting the crater. He had lost his job, lost his health, lost everything but his obsession with the place where his family had died. He built a crude shelter near the fence line and lived there through winter and summer. watching the crater, listening for voices, waiting for something he could not articulate. Local authorities tried to remove him several times, but he always came back, and eventually they gave up and let him stay. He became a fixture of the landscape, the crazy man who lived by the haunted hole. A cautionary tale parents told their children about what grief could do to a person. In the spring of 1937, David disappeared. His shelter was found empty, his few possessions left behind, the fence cut where it bordered the crater. Search parties combed the area but found no trace of him. The assumption was that he had finally done what everyone feared he would do, had thrown himself into the crater to be with his family. But his body was never recovered, and some people whispered that maybe he had found another way down, some path into the depth that others could not see. That same spring, the Montgomery Coal Company, operating under a new name after reorganization, attempted to reopen mining operations in the area. They brought in engineers and equipment, planning to exploit seams they had mapped before the collapse. But the workers refused to go underground. They reported hearing things in the tunnels, voices singing in the darkness, and no amount of money could convince them to continue. The company tried bringing in workers from out of state, men who did not know the history, but within days they too refused to work. The project was abandoned, the equipment left to rust. Another failure added to the legacy of Blackheath Ridge. Thomas Crane received a letter in the fall of 1937, forwarded through several addresses before finally reaching him. It was from Dr. Pemberton requesting a meeting. They met in a diner in Harlan over coffee that had been reheated too many times and pie that was 3 days old. The professor looked older than his years, his hair gone white, his hands shaking slightly as he held his cup. He had continued his research into the Blackheath Ridge collapse, he explained, and had made discoveries that troubled him deeply. The cave system beneath the old town site was far more extensive than initially believed, connecting to a network that ran for miles through the mountains. More disturbing were the acoustic properties of these caves. Dr. Pemberton had conducted experiments, and the results suggested something extraordinary and inexplicable. Sounds introduced into the system did not simply echo and fade. They persisted, somehow maintained by the structure of the caves themselves, repeating at regular intervals for far longer than any known acoustic phenomenon could explain. But there was something else, something Dr. Pemberton had discovered only recently and had told no one until now. He had gone back to his original recordings from 1932, the ones that had captured the singing, and had subjected them to detailed analysis using new equipment. What he found was impossible yet undeniable. The recordings did not simply capture a single moment of sound replaying. They showed progression. The singing in recordings from different dates was different, as if whoever was singing was moving through a repertoire of hymns in sequence, as if the act of singing was ongoing rather than merely a captured moment repeating. Thomas sat in silence for a long time after Dr. Pemberton finished speaking. The implications were too enormous to process, too disturbing to accept. The professor was suggesting that something down in those caves was still singing, still had been singing for 5 years, and showed no signs of stopping. It was impossible. People could not survive that long without food or water or light. Whatever was making those sounds could not be human, could not be the choir that had fallen with the church. Yet Dr. Pemberton insisted his data was solid. He had checked and rechecked his methods, had consulted with colleagues who confirmed his findings while offering no explanation for them. He was a scientist, he said, a man who dealt in observable facts and measurable phenomena, and he could not explain what he had discovered. He had come to Thomas because he needed to know if the survivors wanted this information made public, or if they would prefer he keep silent and let the mystery remain unsolved. Thomas thought about his children, now teenagers, who rarely spoke of that November morning and seemed to have moved beyond it. He thought about the other survivors, scattered and trying to rebuild. He thought about the families of the dead who had finally begun to find some measure of peace. And he thought about David Hutchins, disappeared into the crater, perhaps still searching for answers in the darkness below. Thomas told Dr. Pemberton to publish his findings. The world deserved to know, he said, even if the truth was stranger and more troubling than anyone wanted to accept. The professor nodded, finished his coffee and left the diner. Thomas never saw him again. Doctor. Pemberton's paper was submitted to academic journals, but rejected by all of them, dismissed as flawed methodology or outright fraud. His reputation suffered, and he withdrew from public life, his groundbreaking discovery buried under professional skepticism and institutional unwillingness to accept data that challenged fundamental understanding. The years rolled forward. World War II came and went, pulling young men from the mountains to fight in distant lands. The Depression finally ended, replaced by post-war prosperity that transformed America but largely bypassed the coal regions of Appalachia. Blackheath Ridge faded from public memory, becoming just another abandoned town in a region full of them. The crater filled with more water, becoming a pond surrounded by mature trees that had grown up through the ruins. Nature reclaimed what humans had abandoned. Thomas Crane grew old in Harlan, Kentucky. He retired from mining at 65, his lungs damaged by decades of coal dust, his back bent from years of working in low tunnels. His children had moved away, found jobs in cities, built lives far from the mountains. His wife had died in 1952, her heart giving out while she hung laundry in the backyard. He lived alone now in a small house with too many empty rooms, surviving on a modest pension and social security. On November mornings, he still thought about that Sunday in 1932. The memories had not faded with time. If anything, they had grown sharper, more vivid, as if his mind was determined to preserve every detail before age took even that from him. He could still hear the rumble from below, still feel the floor dropping, still see the faces of people he had known all his life, contorted in fear and confusion. And he could still hear the singing, that impossible, persistent singing that had continued even as the world ended around them. In 1965, Thomas received a package with no return address. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape and a brief typed note. The note explained that the sender had been exploring the old Blackheath Ridge site with recording equipment, had captured something they thought Thomas should hear. They did not sign their name or provide contact information. Thomas borrowed a tape player from a neighbor and, alone in his living room on a cold December evening, played the recording. The quality was poor, full of static and interference, but underneath the noise he could hear it, singing. Faint and distant, but unmistakably there. And more than that, he recognized the voices. Not individually, perhaps, after so many years, but collectively. It was the choir, the same choir that had sung as the church sank. 33 years later, they were still singing. Or something was singing with their voices, or the mountain itself had learned their songs and would not let them end. Thomas sat in his chair and wept. He wept for the 73 people who had died. He wept for the survivors who had scattered and struggled and mostly failed to find peace. He wept for himself, for the burden of being one of the last who remembered when Blackheath Ridge was alive, who knew the names and faces of those who had been swallowed by the earth. And he wept because the singing would not stop, would never stop, would echo through the caves below the mountains until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust. He died 6 months later, in his sleep, in the same chair where he had listened to that final recording. His children came from their distant cities to handle his affairs, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated possessions. They found the tape but did not play it, had no context to understand its significance. It was thrown away, lost to history like so much else. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find the crater that swallowed the First Baptist Church of Blackheath Ridge. It sits in a hollow, surrounded by state forest land, marked on no official maps, accessible only by rough trails that four-wheel drive vehicles can barely navigate. The pond has grown deeper over the decades, its surface covered with lily pads in summer, frozen solid in winter. Trees crowd close to its edges, their roots reaching down into earth that never quite feels stable. And if you visit on a November morning, early before the sun has burned off the fog that settles in the valleys, and if you stand very still and listen very carefully, you might hear something rising from that water, from the depths below where the church fell and kept falling into caverns that have never been fully mapped. It might be wind moving through underground passages, or water dripping in vast stone chambers, or the acoustic ghost of sounds made long ago. Or it might be something else entirely, something that defies explanation, something that suggests the boundary between possible and impossible is thinner than we want to believe. The people of the surrounding towns do not talk about Blackheath Ridge anymore. The few who remember tell their grandchildren to stay away from that hollow, to avoid the pond in the woods, to never go looking for the place where the church sank into the earth. But some people always go looking, drawn by curiosity or skepticism, or that peculiar human need to confront the inexplicable. Most leave disappointed, having found only an abandoned crater and the remnants of a town that time forgot. But some leave changed, their certainty shaken, their understanding of the world fundamentally altered. They heard something in those woods, they insist, something that should not exist, but does. They heard the choir of Blackheath Ridge still singing after all these years, their voices preserved in stone and water and darkness, still singing as they fall through spaces that have no bottom, still singing because singing is all they have left, still singing because the earth that swallowed them will not let them stop. The macabre choir that sang as the church sank into the earth, singing forever in the mountain's hollow heart, their hymns the only memorial they will ever have. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.